Okay, it looks like everyone who is trying to join right now is connected to audio. So we'll go ahead and jump in. I'll kick it over to Matt McVie, the VP of Regulatory Policy and Operations, to go ahead and welcome us and kick us off this morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is, I believe, our first CEP engagement meeting of 2024. So it's been a little while. We've, during that time, we filed the IRP update with the Commission. We filed a rate case, which I will talk about in a little bit. But we do appreciate all of your time showing up on a Friday morning, a sunny Friday morning. To talk about these things, and we look forward to a good, in-depth discussion. So appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. We're really excited to jump in and engage with you all. As Matt mentioned, this is our first CEP, or Clean Energy Plan, engagement series of 2024. So we have a host of things that we'd like to engage you all on and get some discussion around. Prior to jumping in, though, want to make sure that we cover some meeting experience items to make sure everyone has the best experience possible. First of all, I'm sure that you all got a little note about it, but this meeting will be recorded. The recording as well as notes will be posted to the Pacific Power website. And if you have any issues or questions on where that can be found, we're happy to link you to those as a resource. We also are happy to be able to provide both Spanish and ASL translations. If you would like to use one of those options, please navigate to the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It might also be under the three dots with the More button, and select ASL under Watch or Spanish under Audio. And that should get you all synced up to be able to engage in the way that you feel the most comfortable. We also love for this to be a human experience. So where you are comfortable, would love for you to come on camera when we're having some discussion. But again, that's not required, only if you're comfortable and in a position to do so. I know some of us, especially on a sunny Friday morning, as Matt mentioned, might be on the way to do other things. So want to make sure that you're able to participate in a safe but productive way. Also, if you are having any technical support issues, you can go ahead and direct message tag /eSource as your recipient, and he'll be able to help troubleshoot some of those for you to make sure that you're able to fully engage. Lastly, we do accept questions at any time. Feel free to raise the hand via the icon, or drop something in the chat. We'll be monitoring it throughout this meeting, and whenever there's a good pause in the presentation, we'll go ahead and raise those to the presenters to make sure that you get your questions answered or your comments heard. As you see on the right of the screen, we have a pretty good agenda for you guys this morning. The first half of the meeting will be update based. So we'll touch on regulatory and clean energy plan updates, as well as updating on the integrated resource plan and the biennial report. After the break, we'll come back and hear about CBIs, or otherwise known as community benefit indicators. And particularly, we'll be touching on resilience, as well as following that, the intersectionality and the community-based renewable energy pilot. So very excited to be able to provide all of these to you, and excited to hear what you all have to say on these. Next slide. want to go ahead and anchor us on the purpose of why we are here this morning, which is to provide an integrated lens on clean energy planning with expanded opportunities to foster a deeper understanding of programs and outreach while gathering public input. Key part of that is public input. So again, appreciate you all being here and are very excited to hear what you have to say. You'll also see the objectives, which very closely align to the agenda. Next slide. Of course, in order to bring this agenda to you, it would not be possible without a whole host of people, but especially those that you see on the screen and the teams that they work with. So we have a bunch of folks here to really dive into the material and make sure that we're able to provide that deeper understanding and that shared understanding. We'll let everyone introduce themselves as they are getting ready to present, but wanted to at least show you who you'll be hearing from and put some faces to some names. Next slide. So here is where I'll hand it back to Matt to touch on those regulatory updates. Not hearing you, which is weird
Okay,
because
can you hear me now?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, all right, I have a double mute issue. Thanks again for participating in this. We do, during these meetings, we've been frequently, not every meeting, but providing some regulatory updates as we go, just for transparency, just so everyone knows, what's going on at the commission and the company. And so this is really focusing on some of the rate issues. Now, again, apologize for doing this. Talking about rate cases and increasing costs on a sunny Friday morning and starting off this proceeding. We don't want to start it off on kind of that note of the potential rate increases, but it is a reality of the business, and as costs go up, we don't like doing rate cases. We've tried to keep our rates flat, and in the past we've been able to have long periods of time where we didn't even file a rate case. We had 8 years before 2020, and 2020 is when we really started to do investments in transmission and renewables with repowering. Let me start with our general rate case. I assume some people are going to be very familiar. Some people on the call will be very familiar with the rate case, but for those that aren't, we filed our application on February 14th of this year. It is a larger case. We're requesting $322 million. It's about a 17.9% increase. I break the drivers of the rate case into 2 groups. One is general rate case drivers. So these are the costs of doing business. This is recovery of the investments that we make to serve our customers. So you see that the large portion of that, the largest portion of that, is a combination of gateway transmission to integrate more renewables and allow kind of that increased flow of renewables to serve all of our customers. It also facilitates more market access to reduce their power costs and new wind generation. This is for Rock Creek and Rock River projects. So between those two, you're looking at close to 80 million of investments, and that kind of advance our decarbonization efforts. We also are looking at an increase in the baseline to the vegetation O&M. This is we have regulatory mechanisms that we track these costs. And so if we don't spend that amount, it goes back to customers. For those that are not familiar with how rates work, the only return for shareholders is based on investments. And so that is fundamentally to promote the investments, to promote electrification of the country, to promote resource transition. And so as far as the O&M goes, those are just cost spent. And so we do think that mechanism is very helpful because it just allows us to vary the vegetation projects based on what we're seeing in that year. If we don't spend it, we return it to customers. We are asking for an increase in the ROE. We've seen this for across the country, that the return on equity for shareholder investments, so the equity investments in the business, are going up. We're also seeing it as an increasingly risky business, and that's how you set the return, is based on risk. We are looking for wildfire restoration costs, and so these are the investments to replace poles and wires after wildfires. We did also see an increased cost of debt. So the market, we've received a couple downgrades from both Moody's and S&P. That has affected our debt. We still have access to the debt markets, and we've been able to get them at pretty favorable terms, but not as low as what we used to have. But we also had some of the lowest cost of debt of all utilities prior to the last couple of years. And then, one thing I wanted to call out for these traditional drivers is, while we're in a period of significant inflation, our cost escalations, which is essentially those inflationary costs, so this is labor and non-labor, the cost of salaries, the cost of equipment, we've kept that down. So that is, of this whole thing, you're looking at, it's about 3%. We've kept the cost escalations down. We try to keep our expenses that flow through to customers as flat as possible. Now, there's a second part of this case. So the second part is really the insurance drivers. So this includes, we had a drastic increase in insurance in 2023. All utilities did. We saw it doesn't matter where a wildfire is. If a utility is in an area where there can be wildfires, their insurance rates are going up. We saw, and this is happening to all utilities. Avista, PacifiCorp, and Puget spoke to the Washington Commission late last year, and that each utility was talking about how the insurance premiums were going up for every fire across the country. So they went up after the Maui fire. So the quotes people were getting before the Maui fire were significantly less than after. And with wildfires hitting in other parts of the country, underwriters are becoming more and more nervous. And if you can't judge the risk, you're going to charge more for it. So we had increased costs for liability insurance last year, which covers this year. We're looking at more of that, and so we're exploring in the rate case some additional options, such as self-insurance and a catastrophic fire fund. These are mirrored off what was established in California in order to maintain energy service for the entire state. And so we're proposing that. We also have some additional discussions where we're trying to figure out, how would we allocate those costs? Should those costs be allocated based on our typical allocation for among our states, or is there something else that we should be addressing? And we've got some ongoing discussions on that. The Wildfire Mitigation Plan AAC true-up, that's automatic adjustment clause. That's actually a mechanism that we got agreement on with most of the parties last year, and this is just a true-up. So we're essentially taking $21 million out of base rates and we're putting it into this mechanism. So that is not an additional cost to customers. It's just moving it from one frame or basis for collection to another. So we expect a decision in December 2024, and then rates would be effective Jan 1, 2025. So next slide. So in addition to that, rate making in Oregon has several components. And so what I talked about with the rate case and rate cases are base rates. And so base rates, they essentially recover the cost of operation and the cost of investments. And investments are funded in a combination of equity and debt. But we also have some net power costs. So this is the cost of producing or purchasing power to serve customers. And so we do an annual filing called a transition adjustment mechanism to forecast net power costs for the next year. This is part of the open access legislation from 1999, 2000. And so we have to forecast net power costs. So if someone wants to go to direct access, so they could choose a different energy provider, they'll know what those transition costs are, because we're trying to prevent cost shifting. We can't have a customer leave the system and then have all of the remaining customers pick up their share of the costs. There has to be a transition away from that. Otherwise, you would have, large sophisticated customers leaving after we've built big resources to serve them, and then we would shift those costs to the other industrial customers, residential customers, or commercial customers. And so this is a bit of a protection for our remaining customers. Now, that forecast gets updated periodically through it, but right now, based on the information we had when we filed, it was a 1% reduction in net power costs across the entire company. So for that one also, we expect an order sometime in October. We'll do a final calculation based on the most recent information we have. And that will occur in early November, and then we post those rates on November 15th for anyone that's considering direct access. And then the rates are effective Jan 1. The power cost adjustment mechanism, this is the true up. So this is kind of the bookend to the transition adjustment mechanism. You might hear it referred to as a TAM and PCAM. So the PCAM is where we recover our actual power costs from the prior year. Now, we filed a power cost adjustment mechanism this year. It's pretty large. We had under collected for the net power cost by 154.1 million. But the PCAM also has significant debt band and sharing bands. And what that means is that there's if we over collect or under collect by a certain amount, then we don't get recovery, or we don't charge customers, or sorry, we don't refund to customers. So it's if we under collect by 30 million, then the company essentially just, that's just part of business. If we over collect by 15 million, then we don't refund that to customers. So customers don't get the benefit if we over collect. And then outside of that, we have a sharing band. So then it becomes 90-10. So, we would return 90% of any over collection beyond 15 million back to customers, and we keep 10%. And it works the opposite way on the other side. And then there's also an earnings test. So we have to be earning much lower than our ROE. In this case, this is, I believe, the third year that we're going to be seeking recovery of those costs, because it's the third year that we've met all three of those requirements. So this is not something that we've had a long track record on. This is just coming in, and we're seeing, because of the markets, we're running into these situations now. Then we also have the Wildfire Mitigation Vegetation Management Plan and the Wildfire Protection Plan Automatic Adjustment Clause. And so these, I referred to that automatic adjustment clause with the rate case. We're doing a true up. These are filings where we're making adjustments based on our actual spend. And so the Wildfire Mitigation Vegetation Management Mechanism, sorry, that's a mouthful. We're looking at a decrease this year. It's not a lot. It's 7.9 million or 0.4%. But that filing has gone in, and we spent less, so we're going to return that money to customers. The Wildfire Mitigation Plan, that one, we wait until the Wildfire Mitigation Plan is approved by the Commission, and then we file based on the costs associated with the components of the plan that are approved. So that'll go in July. And I believe that, oh, sorry, there is one more. If we go to the next slide. So the Clean Energy Plan, if we go to the next slide there, I'll just give a quick update on the process there. So this is part of the LC 82 docket. This is both our IRP update and our Clean Energy Plan. So in April 1 of this year, PacifiCorp filed its 2023 IRP update. This addressed addressed changes in federal and state policies, had some modeling improvements to integrate state requirements. On May 30th, PacifiCorp did a presentation to the commission and public meeting. So that's available online on the commission's website. We received comments from parties last Friday, and then we're going to be responding to those comments on July 12th. And then there's a special public meeting on the 8th. Now, also importantly, we are starting the 2025 IRP. The public input meeting process has already started. And so, that's going to lead into the next clean energy plan. And so we hope that everyone's participating or everyone's interested is participating in that public input meeting process. And so with that, I will take any questions, or we can move on to the next section, the IRP.
Yeah, we'll give it just a minute here to see if anyone drops something into the chat or raises their hand or comes off mute. Sometimes finding that button fast enough is a struggle. So happy to just have people come off mute and chime in as well. Again, noting it a little bit of a heavy topic for a Friday morning, but an important thing to communicate to you all, which is why we're here and kicking us off with this.
And if anyone's new to the rate making process, I'm happy to talk just about kind of the theories and the policies that's developed over the past, essentially 120, 130 years. It is kind of, there's a lot of basis for, why it is the way that it is. And I always think that if you understand the basis for it and the rationale for it, then it's a lot easier to start thinking about, where are there improvements, where are there changes, but what actually works really well.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any hands or comments, so I guess we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, but just dropping a plug to what Matt just said is there were similar presentations that were given in the equity advisory spaces. So happy to link folks to those notes or those presentations should you want more information on the process. Matt did a deep dive on it, and I know I personally learned a lot and can't speak high enough about it. But
Right.
with that, thank you, Matt, and we'll hand it over to Randy Baker to touch on integrated resource planning.
Hello, I trust everybody can see and hear me.
Yep, coming in loud and clear, Randy.
All right, let's go ahead and dive into the next slide. Yeah, my name is Randy Baker, Director of Resource Planning. I oversee the Integrated Resource Planning Group and thought it would be useful to overview the IRP process and recent activities, discuss some improvements and outcomes for our long-term planning, and also to talk about activity at the federal level that will impact the Clean Energy Plan. As was just mentioned, if you've been in some of the other advisory group spaces, some of this will be review. There's also some content here that I have not discussed before, so I trust that will still be useful to you. So on this slide, at a high level, we produce a plan on a regular cycle that forecasts the best strategy to generate energy and meet customer resource needs over the next 20 years. We create this plan with a combination of research, public engagement, and mathematical models. And as you can see on this slide, particularly at left, the primary focus is our customers. When we create an integrated resource plan, our customers are front and center, and this is structured directly into how we model our system. For example, our primary method of comparing different possible plans for energy resources is searching for the portfolio of resources that will allow us to run our piece of the power grid at least cost and least risk. And keep in mind that's least cost for our customers and least risk for our customers. As you can see, and I just mentioned the word portfolio, so let me talk about that for just a moment. You'll hear the word portfolio used pretty frequently when we talk about integrated resource planning. A portfolio of resources means a coordinated set of resources, could be solar, wind, battery storage, gas plants, but a coordinated set of resources working together that fulfill our obligation to our customers, such as supplying reliable energy. You'll also hear the term preferred portfolio, which refers to that one set of coordinated resources that represents the best plan for our customers. Um, so in the illustration at the left, we ensure that we maintain this customer focus by maximizing transparency. This includes public input meetings like this one, and I'll talk more about our schedule and other public input meetings a little later. It also includes making our models agnostic to technologies, such as wind, solar storage, natural gas, as I've mentioned. We strive to make sure that the inputs to our models are correct so that the outcomes fairly represent the advantages and disadvantages of each technology. Some key factors, of course, are fuel costs, operating costs, reliability, how much each resource aligns with customer needs and timing across the PacifiCorp system. In order to meet the goals of all of our states in our 6-state territory, we create different kinds of portfolios to evaluate. One portfolio is for the entire PacifiCorp system and has no additional constraints. Some, such as the Clean Energy Plan or Washington's Clean Energy Implementation Plan, we create portfolios for those which have some additional requirements and constraints. One objective is to make sure that all states, like Oregon, are properly represented without colliding with other states' interests. And that is a challenge. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But in this way, we represent all of our customers while meeting all state and federal requirements. On the right-hand side of this slide, I just mentioned the multi-state nature of PacifiCorp, but I'd like to focus on that a little more closely for a moment. In order to produce an integrated resource plan with a preferred portfolio for the whole system, we also have to adhere to all states' timing requirements and meet certain regulatory milestones. The integrated resource planning schedule and the milestones we talk about in the next slides are driven by those timing requirements. Stakeholder feedback is also crucial. We solicit feedback and provide several means for reaching us with questions, concerns, and suggestions. More detail about that in a later slide. I think it's worth noting that some of our requirements and scheduling are driven by the most restrictive states' timing. So for example, for Oregon, we have a 2-year cycle for the integrated resource plan. In Washington, they have a 4-year cycle. And that means that since we have to produce a plan every 2 years regardless, Washington sees some benefit of Oregon's 2-year process as a result of needing to meet the more demanding requirement. So yeah, we welcome public participation. We are moving into our 4th public input meeting for the integrated resource plan next week. That's June 26th and 27th. I'll provide some information for how to connect to that if you're interested. And I think with that, I'd like to move on to the next slide and talk about the IRP cycle. So at a high level, PacifiCorp's integrated resource plan is a long-term 20-year plan that relies on forecasts of expected future conditions to guide mathematical modeling aimed at finding the best path forward to meet those future conditions. The IRP, as I mentioned, is published on a 2-year cycle, but we also do an update to the IRP in the off years. So a significant filing occurring every year, but the real heavyweight champion of the IRP filings is the integrated resource plan itself that happens every 24 months. An important point about this cycle is that as the world changes, plans change. And this is reflected in every IRP report that we distribute. And it's one of the reasons why we update it on a yearly basis. This figure provides a view of that development cycle for creating an IRP. It typically spans about 15 months. During those months, public engagement is ongoing through a series of meetings and other communications. Starting at the left on this figure, with the yellow part of that flowing line, we launched the 2025 IRP cycle in January of this year, announcing our meeting schedule, setting up the first public input meeting. That meeting was held on January 25th. And as I said, we're moving into our fourth public input meeting and plenty more to come. That green star toward the middle of the figure represents approximately where we are in the process today. Even now, the integrated resource planning team is pursuing those green bubbles that are shown in the chart, planning for new energy and policy requirements, gathering and discussing inputs and assumptions, and then moving on through the process. We'll be committing that data and modeling updates to our mathematical model, performing analytics, presenting a draft preferred portfolio, and finally, somewhere at the end of month 15, we will be filing the actual integrated resource plan. The draft is expected to come out January 1 of 2025, which is just a few months from now. And the IRP itself, the 2025 IRP, is expected to be filed March 31st of next year. Let me pause there. I've talked a bit about the cycle and objectives for the IRP at a high level. Are there any questions?
Not seeing any right now, Randy, but if any hands get raised or questions get dropped in the chat, you'll be the first to know. Oh, and I said too soon because Alessandra De La Torre did raise their hand. So happy to hear your contribution, Alessandra.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, good morning. I just had more of a simple question in regards to these public meetings and engagement, just like how have they gone? What have been some of the highlights in these meetings? Some takeaways from y'all, just to kind of, and even like with the type of stakeholders that have been showing up, the good things, bad things, just a little bit of information. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And I'll answer from the perspective of the IRP public input meeting series. There was a time not too long ago when that was really the only public input meeting series that I was involved with. And of course, we've kept that as we've gone forward through the years. But now we have, because of additional requirements, state legislation, increased interest of stakeholders, regulatory requirements, now we have so many public input meeting forums, which is great. I just feel sorry for the folks that have to hear parts of my presentation multiple times. But in terms of how those go and who comprises those meetings, mostly I would say it's comprised of stakeholders who are associated with interested groups. It might be, any of our regulatory staff. It might be an environmental group that has an interest in what's happening, usually associated with a particular state in our system. So it might be, a Wyoming group that has commercial interests. It might be a Utah group that has interest in community developments of renewables. Certainly in Oregon, we've got Sierra Club and a host of different associations. And I would say that those are probably our most reliable participants. But in addition to that, we also have members of the public who join those meetings from time to time to ask questions and investigate what it is that we're doing. We have in the past had folks in communities impacted by our company's business come to meetings and ask questions and share their concerns. I would say that generally speaking, We have 50 to 100 participants at any given meeting. And from my experience, I never know 100% for sure who will be at a particular meeting. We also try to give some advance notice of our agenda in the emails that we send out to our stakeholders. That probably shapes it somewhat if it's a topic that you're interested in or not. And I'll give you just an example. I mean, we talk about in that public input meeting series, our intent is to cover absolutely every significant data input, assumption, the thinking behind our modeling, everything that goes into our mathematical modeling. We discuss all of the regulatory factors that impact the IRP. There's no doubt that we can't hit everything, but we definitely, I think, hit every major topic and seek feedback and try to incorporate that where we can. Just recently, for example, we had a meeting where some folks very clearly were giving us suggestions on how we might do our mathematical modeling differently. That was a bit unusual. Usually the discussions are more high level, involve policy, involve conceptual information and things that are going on in the news, for example. In this case, it was right down into my area of expertise, which is the modeling and the math itself. That was interesting, at least for me. But anyway, the topics can range the whole field, the entire field. We don't always have answers or the subject matter experts we need at that particular meeting because we weren't anticipating everything. But we do make an attempt to follow up, respond, and get people the information that they need. I hope that helps, Alessandra.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Very welcome. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So moving into a little more detail on states and states' roles in the 6-state system that I've mentioned, modeling improvements that we've recently made affect how Oregon is represented in our preferred portfolio in their integrated resource plan. Previous integrated resource planning cycles have sought to meet state level requirements by layering on needed resources for each state after the final selection of a system-wide least cost, least risk portfolio. In other words, we would come up with an optimal portfolio for all the states together, leaving out some of the requirements and constraints of individual states. Then we would take into account what each state needs and add some resources back into the portfolio to represent that. And there were good reasons for doing this at the time that we developed that strategy, because as of a year and a half ago, roughly 95+% of the resources that were optimal for any one state were optimal for all of the states. So they were very similar outcomes, regardless of which particular state's perspective you were leaning into. But as of the 2023 IRP update, which was distributed on April 1st of this year, just a short time ago, all portfolios representing PacifiCorp's 6-state territory are instead integrated into a final preferred portfolio so that state resources are optimal and not incrementally layered on top. And if that's not entirely clear, I'm hopeful that it will become clear over the next few bullet points, and particularly on the next slide that I'm going to talk about. But the way the process works is we complete initial modeling runs to represent the states, including, and I mean, here's a portfolio for Oregon, here's a portfolio for Washington that includes its requirements and constraints. And we include amongst those modeling outcomes an unconstrained model that we run for states that don't have additional state-specific policy requirements for the IRP. So the next step is we take the model run results and we compare them for all similarities and differences. So how does the unconstrained model compare to Washington? How does that compare to Oregon? How does Oregon compare to the all the unconstrained model. Each portfolio's selections are then incorporated into a new portfolio that captures two things. Number one, the common features of all models, and also captures each state's specific outcomes. And for a visual on how this works, we can turn to the next slide. So this is a view of the overlapping portfolio results taken from the recent IRP update that I just mentioned. If you're familiar with Venn diagrams, this slide is showing the overlaps and distinctions in the latest preferred portfolio, just like a Venn diagram. Oregon resources are all looped in that rounded rectangular yellow outline. Washington resources are grouped in blue, and the unconstrained model representing all other states at this point in time are grouped in red. The overlaps reveal which resources in each portfolio are shared and which are not. So that large red rectangle, for example, that's labeled rest of system, depicts system resources selected in the unconstrained portfolio. The solid red boxes at the top of the diagram show the resources in that model, the unconstrained model, that are not shared with either Washington or Oregon. And this includes, for example, 395 megawatts of natural gas peaking resources, and of course, the portion of energy efficiency and demand response that are state specific. The large yellow rectangle representing the Oregon Clean Energy Plan portfolio, you'll see that there's solid yellow boxes at the right that don't overlap with anyone else. They just belong to Oregon. And that includes 224 megawatts of non-emitting peakers, 369 megawatts of solar, 69 megawatts of wind, and energy efficiency and demand response. And just to note, energy efficiency and demand response are always state specific, so they always get grouped out and are not shared. Also, if you mix Washington's blue with Oregon's yellow, you end up with green. And if you look toward the middle of the diagram, you'll see a green box. What that green box tells us is that Oregon and Washington's portfolios both selected this particular resource, whereas the rest of the system did not. Oregon therefore shares 134 megawatts of 4-hour batteries with Washington in this latest outcome. Oregon also shares a great deal of the unconstrained portfolio, and that's represented in the white boxes at the center. And so those white boxes are the significant majority of resources that all portfolios select, recognize the value, and they get included every time. This includes 1,700-ish megawatts of solar, almost 4,000 megawatts of wind, more than 2,000 megawatts of storage, and 500 megawatts of clean baseload represented by the Natrium project. And those are shared by the entire resource, including Oregon and Washington. Another quick note about this is displaying all of the selections from now up through 2032. It's not the full 20-year representation. There's reasons for that. 2032, if you go into details, is an interesting and significant point in the modeling horizon, but I won't explore that here today. But the gist of it is that if you have a resource that's in one of those white boxes, then every state gets its share of that resource. If it's something shared between just two states like Oregon and Washington in that green box, only those two states are going to get a share of that resource. If it's outside of any overlap, that state gets the entire thing apportioned to it. Okay, so hopefully that is becoming clearer what the new strategy is for integrating portfolios. The next couple of slides actually go into an example and attempt to illustrate how this actually functions. So on the next slide, an example of integration of state requirements. Let's talk about Oregon's small scale requirement. It's got a few nuances to it that other states don't have, but it's a good example for a couple of reasons. The first thing to recognize is that there are factors. When I talk about sharing and Oregon's share, there's actually a factor that gets applied to modeled resources that tells you how much of a given resource, in essence, belongs to Oregon. And I'll put that in air quotes. Oregon's share is an important concept in a 6-state energy system. PacifiCorp's footprint, if you will, in terms of load and customers served, varies with each state. Oregon represents approximately 25% of our system. So what that means is that if a system resource is selected out of our mathematical model, adding 1,000 megawatts of solar power, all else being equal, Oregon would have about a 25% interest in that 1,000 megawatts, or in other words, 250 megawatts. So following this example along, a model run that, oh, and I also need to note, excuse me, that there's a ratio required for small scale resources of 10%. So if you take Oregon's retail load, retail sales, I believe it is, take 10% of that number, that much of Oregon's resources that are aimed at serving Oregon requirements needs to be small scale as opposed to utility scale resources. And you know, the reasoning for that behind the legislation, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but you know, there are advantages to having resource generation that is small scale, more community based, as opposed to a larger scale, even though it's cheaper, utility resource that may require more transmission investment. So there's some pros and cons. I'll talk about that just a little bit more as we move forward. But you know, at a high level, if you apply the small scale requirement for Oregon to our modeling, you get roughly 550 megawatts of small scale solar that you need and 200 megawatts of small scale wind that you need. Now that breakout of 550 and 200 is optimally determined, you know, by taking a percentage of the selected resources that come out of the model. So in the example at bottom here, Oregon's model run has 3,800 megawatts of wind. The unconstrained model only had, only had 3,000 megawatts of wind. So Oregon takes 800 more than the unconstrained model. That 800 is due to Oregon's requirements. Approximately 25% of that 800 differential between the unconstrained and Oregon specific studies is integrated into the preferred portfolio. And it is all assumed to be small scale to meet the CEP or HB 2021 requirements. And then to look at it from a slightly different perspective, the next slide just shows it a little more graphically, but it's an illustration of the same basic numbers. So Oregon's share is that 25%, 10% of it has to be small scale. You end up with roughly the 750 total of renewables to meet small scale compliance. And so using that small scale wind as an example, you get that differential of the 800 megawatts, 25% of which goes to Oregon as its small scale wind, that's 200 megawatts. And that is how the integration, not just of any given resource for a state, but in this case in particular, a small scale resource gets integrated into the total portfolio. Let me stop there and ask if there are any questions. Jim.
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good morning, Randy. Thanks for the presentation. Just a quick question. I think I'm tracking, but just want to make sure. So with the revised setup PacifiCorp's implementing, are there 3 separate model runs in Plexos? One for the unconstrained, which reflects kind of system-wide constraints, and then there will be a separate run for, say, in Oregon, where there'll be state-specific policies reflecting HB 2021, and the SSR requirement, along with those system-wide constraints, and then the third being for Washington. And then with those three separate distinct runs, the common resources that the model selects across all those three runs will kind of be accessible to all PacifiCore clients. And then the incremental units would be proportioned based off some sort of percentage that you're showing here, in this case, 25%. Is that generally kind of the methodology that we're looking at?
Yes, you got it like almost 100% correct. The one distinction that I would make is your use of the term incremental. I would substitute integration, and the reason why is that in the old way that we did it, we would simply take anything indicated for Oregon and just add it on top of an existing portfolio. The integration approach is different from that. It is three models, as you stated, but the unconstrained model is really there to represent the states that are not Oregon and not Washington. And you can integrate them in any direction. If you wanted to say, I'm going to integrate the unconstrained results into the Oregon portfolio, you would get the same result. As opposed to saying, here's like a favored finished portfolio, and now we're just adding stuff onto it. Instead, the integration approach is treating them all equally, if you will. The difference really comes down to taking into account the shares, those factors, making sure that all the components of the original portfolios are intact, but also accounting for the overlap so that you aren't overbuilding the system. You know, if we ran a portfolio that showed 1,000 extra megawatts of solar for Oregon, that model run is still a run of the entire system. It just has the Oregon requirements and constraints applied. And so when the model picks that extra 1,000 megawatts, it's picking 1,000 because it needs the 25% to meet Oregon requirements, and and it's only going to get 25%. That's why we take that resource that was additional in the Oregon study, take its share and bring that over into the new portfolio. And so I wouldn't conceptualize it as adding Oregon or Washington to the unconstrained. I would conceptualize it as taking all three of those portfolios and integrating them to create a new portfolio that has not previously existed.
Got
I hope
it.
that helps.
It does.
It's a
Yeah,
it's a nuance, but it's an important one.
I agree. Very important. Thank you for that walkthrough, Randy. And then just one follow-up question on that. That 25%, for example, in this illustrative example, would that percentage be coming from the kind of the cross-state agreement amongst the different states, or how is that kind of distribution of the resources determined within the model?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and that is, as I understand it, the state generation share that gets talked about as the SG factor. There are various other factors. I used to work on the rec book for PacifiCore, but it was too many years ago, and I don't remember all the details. But yeah, for example, if you're looking at the multi-state protocol, then the factors that are talked about in that environment, those are the factors that we're using. I will say, excellent question, and I will say that from my perspective, how those allocations occur and what the various states agree to, it's going to change, and we will adapt to those changes appropriately.
Thank you, Randy. Really appreciate it.
All right. Before moving on, I just also want to acknowledge a comment in the chat from Marie that the current slide deck that's posted online does not appear to have this slide in it. And that is spot on in a process, or in a effort, I should say, to really make sure that we're doing our best to get material out there, but also balancing that with making sure that it is as up to date as possible and presented in a way that is easily understandable. We did make some last minute updates, but at the end of the day, this slide deck should be represented via that same link that was shared. Again, just really kind of trying to balance keeping you all up to date while also providing things ahead of time. So apologies for any confusion that may have caused. And then also from Marie, for you, Randy, the numbers reflected on this page, are they a hypothetical example or are they from the actual model run? Great question,
These
Marie.
should, yeah, it's a great question. These should align with the 2023 IRP update that was just published, but they are rounded. I don't think it was exactly 25%, and our selections of resources can be, up or down by a few megawatts. So I believe these were rounded just for simplicity's sake. But just in case there's any confusion, the reason that I pointed out that the prior slide showing the Venn diagram, the reason I pointed out that it's current through 2032 is because it doesn't go all the way through the 20-year horizon. And so I believe it was like 359 megawatts of small scale solar, which is smaller than the 550 number you're seeing now. And that's why. That's just a difference between, are we talking about all 20 years or are we talking about a somewhat shorter period? But yeah, I believe all these numbers align with our latest IRP update. I apologize if they don't, but that was the intent.
I was on mute. I was just about to say I wasn't seeing anyone else come off mute, but I guess I should have looked at myself there. Not seeing any other hands raised or questions, but thank you for those responses, Randy.
You're welcome. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. And here we're going to turn toward activities at the federal level that are expected to impact clean energy planning results. They already do affect clean energy planning results, but will in the future as well. So mostly here we're talking about tax credit modeling, but there's a few other things of note. First, let's turn to the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which is listed out in some bullets at the left. On August 16th of 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, aimed at addressing clean energy and climate change. And although the IRA covers many types of credits and activities, overwhelmingly the most important component for our current IRP planning are the two types of tax credits, both of which can offset the development costs and operational costs of non-emitting resources. The two types of credits are the PTC, or Production Tax Credit, or the ITC, Investment Tax Credit. The PTC is a 10-year credit that is based upon the megawatt hours of energy produced by a resource. So it's based on its operations. The ITC, on the other hand, is an upfront tax credit on the build cost of a resource. The Integrated Resource Plan has included both of these tax credits on all future resources built through 2037 as applicable. But different resources are produce more savings if you use one versus the other. And so we have a choice. You can go with the production tax credit, or you can go with the investment tax credit. So for example, solar technology may benefit more from a production tax credit. Wind might benefit more from an investment tax credit. And what we do for the Integrated Resource Plan is we figure out which one is going to produce the more significant cost break for a given technology, and that's the one that we use, so that that particular resource gets the most benefit that it can. But at the same time, that benefit has to be relatively dependable and reliable. If if we can't bank on it, then conservatively speaking, we might not want to include it. But for the production tax credits and the investment tax credits, we've been working with those for a while. They're very solid, and we just picked the best one, and the model sees that, which shapes its decision making and selection of resources. On the right-hand side, for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, on November 21 of 2021, this bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law. The law provides substantial funding for transportation and infrastructure spending and offers financing options which may be beneficial to some energy companies and developers. PacifiCorp is actively pursuing these benefits, applying for grants for resources and currently owned resources. There is, however, I'll point out, a modeling challenge with some aspects of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The modeling challenge here is that some of the advantages, such as being able to achieve under this act a good rate for borrowing or credit, as it were, PacifiCorp doesn't have a way to guarantee that that incentive, which would be significant to developers who want to create a project and then either sell it or operate it. PacifiCorp doesn't have a way to guarantee that those benefits will be passed on to customers and will appear in the project costs that are offered to PacifiCorp. But there can be obviously an effect. We don't know what portion of developers, for example, will necessarily qualify, or which ones will apply, and we don't dictate that. And I am no expert on this subject, but my understanding is that from a conservative perspective, that's something that we want to consider. And the IIJA is being considered freshly for the 2025 IRP. I'll point out now, in case I forget later, that there'll be more detail about federal activities and legislation in the next public input meeting for the Integrated Resource Plan. Again, that's June 26th and 27th. But a couple of things to note are that prices have proven to be quite volatile for resources in recent years. These cost savings and grants, if achieved, either by PacifiCorp or possibly by a developer who wants to offer a project to PacifiCorp, these grants and cost savings can mitigate cost increases that are due to other factors, such as supply issues or materials costs. So I think to a large extent, it's hard to see the future and know, are these going to be offsetting benefits? Are they all going to pass through to customers, or only part of them going to pass through to customers? How hard will it be for folks to apply for grants and actually obtain their objective? So there's a lot of open field there. Consistent with most IRP planning, our treatment of potential benefits tends to be conservative, meaning that we don't assume a benefit will be passed on to customers, until we've had a chance to really explore it and research it and figure it out. And these are recent activities, so I think that it is not quite completely settled yet. So let me cover the next slide, which is in this same topic area. And this is with reference to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's 111D rule. The Environmental Protection Agency on May 9th of this year finalized its standards and guidelines for fossil fuel powered plants, issuing new requirements under 111D. This rule addresses emissions from existing coal-fired power plants and ensures that new combustion turbines will be constructed to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. There's a requirement for plants to achieve emissions reductions that are equivalent to what is possible through the use of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. And to put that slightly differently, the way I understand it, if you're going to have an emitting resource, you don't necessarily have to put carbon capture and sequestration technology on that resource, but you would then have to operate it in such a way that it is as if you did those things. That is my loose understanding. Much more information about this will be talked about in that June 26, 27 public input meeting. And there's a lot to it. It's multiple slides cover this in the next meeting. For the 2025 IRP and the CEP, PacifiCorp will continue to evaluate a number of options for each thermal resource, that's coal and gas primarily, on our system. In recent integrated resource plans, we've already evaluated carbon capture technologies. The requirements under 111D are expected to add additional options and additional constraints. We also model the conversion of coal-fueled to gas-fueled operations, and we also model alternative fuels. Ultimately, constraints on unit operations, how we actually run our system, constraints that are imputed by 111D or other rules or legislation, will impact which options we model and the cost effectiveness of each option. And then we turn the mathematical model loose on it, and it picks out the most optimal overall coordinated set of resources. I'll also note that we keep advancing our modeling to represent more and more options in greater and greater detail. In the 2023 IRP and the recent 2023 IRP update, we modeled early retirement options for gas plants, for example. We've been doing this for coal. Now we've added gas plants. So the model can look at the whole solution and say, do we really need that gas plant any longer? Maybe it should be retired. So far, we have not seen a result where gas plants are being retired. We have seen results where coal plants are either indicated to retire or convert to some other kind of operation, or acquire carbon capture technology. All those different options are on the table. We haven't seen that for gas yet, but it's entirely possible that due to 111D or some other legislative act or some other governmental rule, either at the state or the federal level, plus price drivers, all those sorts of things could drive that to happen in the future. So just because you don't see an option happen in a portfolio, doesn't mean it wasn't modeled. Those opportunities were there. They just weren't selected as being optimal. Let me pause again there and see if there's any questions or comments. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and topic, which is integrated resource planning scheduling. On to the next slide, please. So, as many of you may know by now, we have officially scheduled the distribution of a draft IRP on January 1st of 2025. It is an ambitious undertaking, and really hard-won achievements of the past have paved the way for this to be possible. And it is going to be a heavy lift, I can tell you that. It's not going to be easy. But the fact of our being able to deliver the amended 2023 IRP by May 31st of last year put us in a position where this is achievable. And in order to achieve the objective of that draft, our assumptions and data need to be locked down by the end of September of this year. And because of this, this change in our scheduling, we've added an additional July public input meeting to the Integrated Resource Plan public input meeting series. We have also removed the November and December meetings that would have occurred after September, but before the draft. And the reason is we need to have everything covered in the public input meetings leading up to that September meeting for the lockdown. And so what we've done is we've taken the November and December topics and largely moved them into the prior months, added that additional meeting to give us more time to discuss these topics. And another thing I think you'll see that's different from prior IRP cycles, if you've been a participant in these meetings, is that we've tended to schedule 2 days for meetings, but often we only need one of those 2 days. A lot is dependent upon when data becomes available, when certain important decisions happen in the industry, when decisions get made about legislation and rules being finalized, things that are outside of PacifiCorp control. I anticipate, though, that because of the draft, the acceleration of the lockdown, and the changes to the schedule, I suspect that from here through September, they will all be 2-day meetings or 1.5-day meetings, whatever it takes to accommodate all the materials that are being advanced into the earlier part of the schedule. Next slide, please. And finally, let me finish with some additional information that you can use to participate in the integrated resource planning process. We have these upcoming public input meetings. The next 2 are the June 26, 27 that I've mentioned, the new additional July 17th and 18th meeting. You can find considerable information online for PacifiCorp's IRP and past IRPs. So if you go to the PacifiCorp website following these web links, and I would say particularly if you look at the last one, the IRP support and studies web link, you can find our published documents for the integrated resource plan. Highly encourage people to check it out. You can also find recordings for this cycle for our IRP meetings. So if you're interested in the 3 meetings we've had so far, you can go online and listen to those recordings. And I believe that that is all I have for today. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Will, I
Will.
see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. Appreciate that overview. This is Will Mulhern with Oregon PUC staff. Just had a question, and maybe this is coming in the next section, but was curious if you plan to share kind of the preferred portfolio changes in the 2023 IRP update. I think you did a nice job of giving an overview of kind of some of the changes to the modeling, but was curious if there were going to be kind of the results shared for this group, and then if there's going to be information on kind of those House Bill 2021 targets. I know the next section looks like it's biannual update. Maybe that's what that's for, but just wanted to see if that was going to be shared, because I think there's some folks here that would be interested in that.
Yeah, I don't have that prepared for this meeting, and the biennial update if it's what I'm thinking of, predates the IRP update. So all I had intended to show for the IRP update is those key selections for the various states and how they're shared and how they're not shared. So I'm not prepared at this meeting to take it any further. I don't know if there's more information on that coming. I don't think so. Others on the call probably know. I've been pretty focused on my own set of slides, to be honest. But if you have additional questions that aren't answered by the update itself, or the conversations that have happened in different venues about the update, I would encourage you to, point those to the IRP mailbox or stakeholder feedback forum, and we'll do what we can to either expand on those or let you know when we might expand on those.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, we certainly feel like we have venues for engaging with that, but was just curious if it might be useful for this group, but appreciate that response.
And I'll plug in right now that I know all of these subject matter experts that are presenting today have gone above and beyond in making themselves available. So We are also happy to take any questions at any time, right? Even outside of the framework of this meeting. So feel free to follow up and we'll make sure that everything will be answered and that it gets to the right inboxes to move things forward. Not the last bite at the apple, as I often say. Not seeing any other hands or people coming off mute, but want to give it another second or so. And then after that, I will hand it over to my facilitation partner and colleague, Jeffrey Daigle. Thank you so much, Randy, for your presentation and the great information that you shared with us today. And welcome
you.
to the virtual stage, Jeffrey.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Daigle, and I'm part of the facilitation team. We want to update you on the progress of the biennial report as part of the CBIAG. So Section 6 of House Bill 2021 calls for the development of a biennial report that, in consultation with the CBIAG, must include an assessment and a variety of reporting on a lot of factors, including energy burden, disconnects, opportunities for contracting, actions within environmental justice communities, grid investments, socioeconomic, environmental, reviews of annual customer satisfaction. There's going to be a lot of data that goes into this biennial report. And as part of our facilitation efforts, we've been working through with the CBIAG to make sure that we have discussions on each of these items. Tag, if you could jump to the next slide for me, please. So just to give you an idea of how these CBIAG meetings are going, and to provide some transparency to that engagement space, we've split our meetings this year into two different spaces. The first half of each meeting has been sort of this Act 1, in which we look at a community benefit indicator and discuss how that's related to the biennial report. So you can see how those conversations have progressed, and where we ended yesterday at the end of the meeting is that we facilitated a discussion on the CBI related to environmental impacts. The discussion on all of these have been quite healthy and robust, provided a lot of feedback for the company to consider. And as we continue to move throughout the summer, we will be continuing to work through the interim CBIs for community benefit indicators and get updates so that we can provide a draft for the CBIAG members to review and to consult on. If you can jump to the next slide for me, please, Tag. Just to give you some insight further into sort of how this biennial report is progressing, Pacific Power really wants this to be a reflective to the community engagement that it's taken to build this. And so the first portion of the biennial report is really going to be focused on a community summary. The Pacific Power acknowledges that this work needs to be really accessible to the community members. Both the CBIAG meeting or tribal engagement spaces are open to the public. But we talk about heavy topics, right? That sometimes are not the easiest for lay people to digest. And we spend a lot of time working with the members in both spaces to make sure that they can digest so that they can provide the right level of feedback on those CBIs. So the community summary is going to be this anchor point at the front that we intend to be accessible and readable and understandable by the community, and will reflect on both the CBIAG members' engagement space as well as the tribal engagement space that Pacific Power hosts and uses to get feedback from the tribal nations within the great state of Oregon. From there, we'll move into an introduction, provide an overview of the layout of the report, and map specifically so that folks that are hunting for a specific item related to House Bill 2021 can find it in the subsequent pages. We'll then highlight 4 additional segments. The first one is about engagement and outreach. We want to be transparent in how these engagement spaces have gone, the kind of feedback that's been received in other engagement spaces, such as these, and the feedback that's taken place in those. We'll then move into a section related to community benefit indicators, and we'll describe the initial development of what are still mentioned as interim CBIs. We'll provide updates on the collaboration and progress of those CBIs and share any of the feedback and actions and impacts related to those. The third section pulls out customer experience and operational data that's related to what some of the asks by House Bill 2021. And then the last section of the biennial report as required for the CBIAG as part of House Bill 2021 will include a timeline for future updates. We really do want to reflect that that Pacific Power has done engaged in a variety of channels to ensure that the community voice has been reflective of this process, that the CBIAG members feel equipped and empowered to provide feedback throughout the process, and that their questions, even if they can't be handled in the meeting, like some of the more difficult ones we had yesterday, are routed to the right person, and then we could circle back on that feedback either in a one-on-one conversation or bring it back in subsequent meetings for the rest of the group to discuss. I'm going to pause here and just see if there are any questions about the engagement spaces outside of this clean energy planning engagement space, or if there are any questions about the biennial report, etc.
Not seeing anything immediately, but I'll also just share those CBIAG meetings are open to the public, so would love additional participants, and you're always welcome to call in and see what they're about.
Agreed. Thank you, Morgan, for that extra point of clarification. Well, I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I think this is my last slide, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Tag next slide. Awesome.
Yep.
Back to you, Morgan.
As you see, we are now at the point where we all get to go fill up our water cups or stretch our legs. So we're going to go ahead and put a 10-minutes to answer emails, go to the restroom, or whatever you needed to take care of this morning. In returning, we're going to go ahead and first hand it off to Lee Elder to touch on community benefit indicators. And then following that, we'll be going over to Kevin Benson to really do a little bit of a deeper dive on resilience. But Lee, you ready to jump in and kick us off?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Go ahead, let's proceed. Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Lee Elder, and I've been pretty involved with developing CBIs. And today, it's our intent to discuss our progress related to our resiliency CBIs. And as a reminder, this slide shows our CBIs with the resiliency CBI highlighted blue on the top there. In addition to resiliency, our other CBIs touch on a number of areas: community health and well-being, environmental, energy equity, and economic impact. And next slide, please. So what are CBIs? CBIs are the outcomes that our communities wish to see occur and that PacifiCorp can influence. Specific to resilience, our CBIs are improved resiliency of vulnerable communities during energy outages, and also reduce the frequency and duration of energy outages. The metrics you see on the right-hand side of the slide here for these CBIs are SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI at area level, including major events, and also the metric of energy not served, which is an output from our IRP portfolios. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Benson to get into specifics of how our PacifiCorp has been making progress with regard to our resiliency CBIs. And with that, Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, and good morning, everybody. There we go. Camera's running now. Kevin Benson, I'm the Director of Asset Risk or Risk Assessment for Pacific Power. I've got a few slides that talk through some analysis that we've done to start quantifying and mapping what we are calling community utility resilience or utility community resilience. And so I'll spend a few minutes talking through the analysis that we've done to kind of get there, and then a little bit more about kind of what's planned in terms of next steps to continue moving forward with that work. So we'll start off just with some definitions here. And what I want to do is highlight the difference between the kind of traditional measurement of electric system performance, which is what we call reliability, and then resilience, and the differences there in terms of kind of what we're going to discuss in the next couple minutes. So reliability, we think of that generally as the day-to-day performance of the system under normal operating conditions. So it's our ability to provide electric service to customers when and where they need it. And resilience is a little bit different than reliability, because what we're looking at here is how well is the electric system able to provide service during various hazards that could occur that may potentially disrupt that service. And so what we're thinking of here is how well is the system able to continue providing service during winter storms or after an earthquake or in the vicinity of a wildfire and things like that. And so it's a little bit different than when we talk about reliability, which is more kind of blue sky or normal operating conditions. And then resilience is when we're looking at something like say a large natural disaster or a winter storm and that type of thing. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how we're taking those reliability metrics and then applying them to the resilience analysis that we've done to give us the perspective that we're looking for. So a few acronyms just to kind of walk through here. The metrics shown on the slide are commonly referenced when talking about electric system reliability, and that's our SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI. And so SAIDI is the System Average Interruption Duration Index. SAIFI is the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, and CAIDI is the Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. And each of those tell us something a little bit different about what's going on with our system performance. And so SAIDI, that's for the average customer in a given time period, typically looked at over a year. For the average customer, how many minutes of power outages would they experience during that year? And then SAIFI is kind of similarly looking at, for the average customer over whatever time period, again, typically a year, the number of outages that a customer would experience. And so these two measures, SAIDI and SAIFI, they give us an indication of kind of the overall health of the system in providing service to our customers. And what CAIDI does, that's the Customer Average Interruption Duration Index, is it looks at our outage data, but instead of trying to figure out for the average customer how long or how many outages are they experiencing, this is looking at if a customer does experience an outage, how long on average is that power outage going to be? So it's a little bit of a different look at it, where we're specifically focusing on customers that are actually affected by a power outage, because not every customer that we serve is going to experience an outage each year. And so what this does is it gives us an indication of when the power goes out, about how long it takes us to restore power to the customers that are affected. There's one other metric shown on the slide here too, which is MAFI, and that's the Momentary Interruption Frequency Index. And so this is a little bit different than the SAIFI metric that we talked about earlier. And there's a kind of a technical distinction here. And so SAIFI, SAIDI, CAIDI, those are looking at what are called sustained outages. And so these are power outages that last for 5 minutes or longer. And momentary outages are any interruptions to service that are less than 5 minutes. And so you can see things like the power might go out or the lights will flicker and then come back on because the automated devices on our system are operating to try to restore power because of a problem that occurred. And so that's when we can see those momentary outages occur, where there's, say, a minute or two when the lights go out, some devices will operate and then the power comes back on. And so what this shows us is another indication of the health of the system, because if there's higher rates of momentary outages, it may mean that there's something worth investigating further. And the last thing that I'll note on this slide is we've got the MED acronym kind of in the middle there, and that's major event days or major events. And so there's a process in place where we can do some analysis to identify when there's a large set of widespread or long duration outages. Those would be classified as what's called a major event. And there's some statistics behind figuring out how big the outage count needs to be, or the number of customers affected needs to be to come up with that. But basically what this does is it allows us to identify, say during a large winter storm that hits, for example, like the Cascades or something like that, that could potentially cause outages over a wide area. And so that would be classified as a major. And that's important for us when we're talking about resilience, because really what we're looking for is the locations that are more susceptible to those types of, say, large or longer duration power outages. And the reason why we're interested in that, we'll start talking about here on the next slide, is because there's a connection between the frequency and duration of power outages and the impact that that has on a community. And this ties into the resilience of that community itself. And if you've seen previous presentations or looked at our clean energy plan or some of the other presentations that have been posted online, you'll see that we were initially looking at vulnerability data that was provided by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And so what they have done is put together a very large set of data that takes into account socioeconomic factors, and then also aspects of the community as an institution. So things like the state of the infrastructure in an area, how capable the local government agencies are at responding to disasters, and then other types of things like the environmental characteristics and, for example, the vulnerability or likelihood of various natural disasters or other hazards occurring in a particular location. And so they put all this information together to come up with two different ways to measure the vulnerability and the resilience of communities related to natural disasters specifically. And that data is very helpful for us, and it kind of leads us to the question that we've got on the bottom of the slide here, which is, how do we take the analysis and the data that FEMA has provided, and then how do we incorporate that into our work as an electric utility to help address service interruptions that may occur in areas that are more vulnerable? And what we've done is laid out on the next slide here. And so we are looking in particular at community vulnerabilities to long duration power outages. And so we, the research kind of shows that in particular, the duration of a power outage affects the potential impact to a community. And there's something kind of maybe intuitive for those of us where the longer a power outage gets, the longer a power outage is, the more of an impact that it can have on us. And we're grouping the potential impacts of those longer duration outages into three categories, and looking in particular at community resilience, or the vulnerability of that community in each of these areas. So that's the health of the community, the preparedness of the community, and the ability of the community to evacuate, or residents of a community to evacuate if they need to, if a natural disaster were to occur. And so there's three different aspects of resilience that we can then incorporate into our analysis of our electric system performance to come up with that community utility score. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what kind of falls into each of these categories, beginning with health on the next slide. And so when we're looking at health vulnerabilities, there are a number of different pieces of data that we're incorporating into the analysis. And so we group these into a few different categories. One is vulnerability to exposure to higher temperatures. I guess the heat wave kind of makes this maybe a topic worth kind of noting here. And there are a couple of different items that have been identified by government agencies and other research that show a correlation between certain health characteristics and susceptibility to health impacts from heat waves. So things like heart disease or asthma, populations where the population, or locations where the population is, say, younger or older, and so they're more exposed and vulnerable to temperature. And then we're also looking at, in addition to some of that health data, the norms within locations based on a 30-year history, looking at peaks in the summer and then the minimum that occurs in the winter. And the reason why that's significant is because although heat can kind of cause health impacts for people, certain communities, certain locations may be more adapted to higher average temperatures for things like more air conditioning or other services available than locations where high temperatures aren't as common. We're also evaluating locations where the customers have requirements for electric service to support their home medical equipment. And so we've got nursing home data available from the Census Bureau. And then we also have internal data for customers that have enrolled in our medical program where we can get that from our customer data to identify where they are in the service territory. Another category here, this is folks with ambulatory difficulty kind of walking or otherwise kind of getting around. Typically, you'll think of this as kind of being defined as if folks have difficulty going up or going downstairs. And so that can be important during a power outage when, say, elevators aren't working properly. And then the last item here that we're looking at for health vulnerabilities is critical medical facilities. So if a town has a clinic or a hospital and the power goes out, would those medical facilities then also be without power and then unable to provide service to their community? And we have that data available also internally. And so we take all this information, put that together under this health vulnerabilities to outage category to give us an idea of how a longer power outage could affect a community from a health perspective. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the details of what we're calling preparedness vulnerability. And so this is the ability or preparation of a community to respond to a natural disaster or other hazard event if it were to occur. And the data that's shown on the slide here kind of comes from some of the FEMA analysis and some other research that we found, which shows that there's a connection between some of these socioeconomic characteristics and the ability of the residents of a community and the community in general to either prepare for or respond to a hazard when it occurs. And so what we're looking at here are things like the age of the community, the portion of the population that has English as a second language or maybe not being, or they're receiving SNAP benefits, and then locations where we have multifamily housing, which indicates higher population density. And so we're able to put all of these together to come up with an indication of if a natural hazard or natural disaster were to occur, or in our case, if a longer power outage were to occur, how prepared is the community to kind of cope with that taking place? And then in our last category, this is where we look at evacuation vulnerability. And so this is important when we're looking particularly at natural disasters and the connection between those and these longer power outages that could result from a natural disaster occurring. And so kind of similarly, there's data available from the Census Bureau, and this is backed up by some research that we've done, which shows that there's connections between things like the portion of the population with children or just generally larger households and their ability to evacuate quickly if kind of called upon by local first responders or government agencies. We've also identified some additional data that can indicate if there's barriers to the ability to evacuate. And so that's things like portion of the population doesn't have access to a personal vehicle or reliable public transportation service. Or if there are emergency facilities or evacuation centers within the community that could provide a kind of refuge closer to folks that they could potentially walk to if needed. And so when we put all of this data together, this gives us an indication of if something were to occur, what's the ability of the people that are living there to just leave and go to a location that's not affected by that natural disaster and the long power outage that could go along with it. And so we take those three categories, that's the health vulnerabilities, the preparedness vulnerabilities, and the evacuation vulnerabilities. And what you'll see on the next slide is a look at a combined community utility resilience score, where we're taking those three together, combining that with our power outage data to come up with scores with the green here, 0 score being the high resilience or less vulnerable locations, and then the red or the higher values going up to 1, where we see lower resilience, higher vulnerability. And we took one additional step, which is we also looked at the resilience scores in comparison to the Justice 40 disadvantaged communities. you're not familiar with that, would encourage you just to take a look. You can Google Justice 40, and there's quite a bit of information available. But this is a government initiative to identify communities based on a number of different socioeconomic factors and other considerations that could be considered disadvantaged from an environmental justice perspective. And so what we've got filled in on the slide here is the resilience scores in areas that were identified as disadvantaged communities by the Justice 40 program. And so this kind of gives an indication of locations within our service territory and within the state of Oregon of where we would see a lower combined community utility resilience, where the community may be vulnerable in one of those categories or more than one of those categories of health, preparedness, and evacuation, or we're seeing more pronounced reliability system performance impacts, particularly during those major events that we were talking about earlier. And so this information is helpful for us when we think about things like program planning and prioritization. And on the next slide, what you can see here is a different view of the results of this analysis. So a lot of dots, a lot of colors and things like that on the screen. But the main thing to look at here is, the green is good and red is bad. And so green is indications where we've got higher community resilience or higher grid resilience. And then red shows us where both of those are lower. And so we've got the map view on the previous slide, and what here we're seeing is for each of these dots, this is representing communities within our service territory, and then they're colored to show if they were identified as a Justice 40 disadvantaged community or not within that categorization. And really what we're after, and you'll kind of see on the next slide here, is focusing our efforts. Oops, actually, if you go back one, please. Yeah, focusing our efforts on locations that have that lower resilience, and that have also been identified as disadvantaged communities under the Justice 40 program. The key thing here is that the analysis is insightful. It kind of gives us some good indications of where we need to look further in the service territory. But we also need to kind of take the next step here and start converting this analysis into action taken by the company to address resilience issues in these vulnerable communities. And as part of our next topic, we're going to talk about one of the programs where the company has begun incorporating this resilience analysis into its planning and its program management. And I think with that, I'll hand things over so we can talk about the community-based renewable energy resilience hubs.
Before jumping over, I just want to give everyone a moment to kind of soak in all that information and make sure there are no questions for you, Kevin, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure thing.
I know it was a lot of information coming at you guys, so just want to make sure everyone had a chance to think on that and provide anything. But I'm not seeing anything immediately, except for in the chat from Jenny Hall. Thank you, Kevin, for creating that understanding. Oh. So I understand the analysis was done at the census tract level.
Yeah, and there's it's a combination of different geographic scales, and that's really dependent on the level that the data is available at. In a lot of cases, it comes in at the census tract level. Sometimes it can be a little bit more granular than that. We can see some data available at a census block group level also, but it is kind of dependent on the scale of the data sets. And then what we're able to do is overlay that to the mapping of the communities that's shown here. So it's kind of a mix and really just sort of dependent on the source data that we're using for the analysis.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. And Sylvia, I saw that your hand was up, so I just want to make sure, was your question answered?
Yeah, I think so. I need a moment to formulate my thoughts, but thank you, Morgan. I appreciate you tracking.
No, of course. Alessandra, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, I was thinking about the kind of resiliency CBIAG and the metric for it, and was curious, since y'all are going to be talking about and doing the Resilience Hub pilot, if that could be added to the metric there to show just the kind of the total amount of hubs that y'all are investing in or supporting to be able to also increase community resilience, so that there's a bit more of like what PAC is doing to invest in that piece now and in the future as well. That could be added to how you measure the success of increasing resilience in a community. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. This is Lee Elder. I think that's great feedback. And that's, I think when we set off on the endeavor of, CBIs and metrics that, we didn't have all the answers and, we didn't know exactly how it was going to materialize over the course of time through input and iterations of it. So, as things are starting to float to the surface and seeing how this is actually taking effect, I think something like that, like, tracking CBI investment, that something of that nature would certainly make sense. So yeah, thanks for the comment. I appreciate that.
Yep, and I see Sylvia agreed in the chat. And before asking you to weigh in, Sylvia, I did see that Jenny also had a follow-up question. So I just want to respect the order that things are coming in at. And Kevin, for you, the question is, are the comparisons of vulnerability done statewide, comparing one part of the state to the other?
To an extent. So the scoring is done on kind of this 0 to 1 scale. So it is comparing like the relative community resilience or grid resilience for each of these communities. And so I guess the answer to your question is yes, noting that we're primarily looking at areas within our service territory. So it is within the state of Oregon, but not the entire state. I guess just to clarify that part as well.
Awesome.
And please let me know if that answered your question or if I was kind of going on the wrong track there.
I was about to ask for a thumbs up from Jenny, but we'll see if we get any follow-up there. And in the meantime, oh, yep, looks like that was a perfect answer. Thank you, Kevin. Sylvia, would love to invite you to contribute.
I put a little thingy on my camera. No, thank you. I wanted to appreciate Alice's comment. I missed the first hour, so I don't know if you had a conversation about kind of the goal of the meetings and if we're starting to look at the 2025 and how the CBIs can evolve. I think it will be really important for this resilient CBI to go beyond the current metrics, which are useful information, but that's to Alex's suggestion, just to get a picture of how much this type of projects that can sustain community resilience, like the resilience hubs, like microgrids are accessible to community. Like, can the company track that? I know as I was hearing Alice's comment, I was thinking it would be very useful to have the information and the number of projects that are supported by the company. But another important or helpful metric might also be to, I feel I think the company would know what other community accessible microgrids are starting to emerge, maybe supported by other funding sources, and so not directly supported by this program, but the CBRE pilot. And to the extent that you can keep track of those and just give us a sense of how that number is increasing over time, I think it would give us an additional helpful sense of increased community resiliency, as we look to future planning cycles. Did that make sense?
Sylvia. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, it makes sense. Lee here. Yeah, I hear you loud and clear, and yeah, that's great feedback.
Thank you for your work. This is really cool and interesting. And I got a little chance to hear a little bit about the exercise of looking at community vulnerability and grid resiliency and overlapping yesterday. And so it's very cool, important exercise to prioritize resiliency focused investments, and maybe also other grid investments can support resiliency and be used through, or the filter can help us look at other types of projects. kind of don't have like a baked idea right now, but this, I think Nikita, like in a separate conversation, had, but that was not my idea. Like I've heard that in the past from Nikita. Just want to give credit where credit is due.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I will agree with you. I think it's also very cool. I think Kevin's team has done pretty great work here. But again, I'm pretty biased. I think it's pretty excellent though what we're seeing from his group.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you all. And I do see some agreement in the chat. Alessandra says, yes, Sylvia, such as House Bill 2021, CREP grant program, and OREM's Resilience Hub grant program. So thank you for providing that. All great feedback. And again, might be biased in getting all the background in developing these presentations, but Kevin and his team is doing great work. So I'm glad to see it getting its limelight. I'm not seeing any other folks coming off of mute or raising their hands. But again, feel free to follow up directly or via chat, and we'll make sure to close that loop and get the information to you all. Thank you so much, Kevin. And I think we can go ahead and pass it over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Harvey. I have seen many of you before in this meeting space, previous presentations about community-based renewable energy. That introductory slide also added another word, which is intersectionality. And so I'm going to be using, actually, I'm commandeering a term that Lee used the other day, which is rubber meets the road, because I want to be using this CBRE RH pilot to speak about how some of what you've been hearing since the break is going to be applied as we move forward with our approach to advancing community-based renewable energy projects. And so I really think that this CBRE RH pilot is kind of an early opportunity for that rubber to meet the road. Maybe I'll start with explaining that CBRE stands for community-based renewable energy, which is a label for a type of project that came out of our HB 2021 legislation a little while ago now. It's a pretty wide umbrella term that applies to all sorts of projects that are renewable energy focused and that provide community benefits. Lots of different types of RE, and there's lots of different types of CB also. And so with this pilot, and I think that some of you have heard me speak about this before, it's very much our intention to zoom in on a subsection of that wide range of project types and really focus on resilience hubs, which is that RH. It's not my initials as much as I'd like them to be, but the focus on resilience hubs being developed to to provide additional resilience, specifically at critical facilities within communities. And so these are the three components, the three ways that we are proposing that we will be advancing projects in various stages of development that communities demonstrate an interest in. So the first you see there is the continued provision of feasibility studies for folks that are just getting going with their level of understanding and interest about what enhanced resilience might look like at critical facility sites in their communities. I'll skip to the third because it's also relatively easy to explain, which is the opportunity to provide grant match funding, whether that's actual financial, like hard cold cash, or if it's in-kind contributions, and that those would be provided to communities that are interested in other forms of grant awards. And so there's a a mechanism that we think is important to support the gathering up of some of the other money that we even heard about earlier today. And then back to number 2, this is to provide some support and really kind of lock arms in partnership with a handful of projects that have already received some funding. So they're already actually, moving down the road, and, we want to become partners because there is an awful lot of learning and an opportunity to work together as those projects become operational. So I wanted to, get back to that intersectionality piece. We foresee the use of those resilience metrics that Kevin had just shared a few slides back, playing a pretty major role in at least 2 of these 3 components. So, our plan is to use those metrics to identify communities that have the highest resilience risks. So you remember the heat map with the identified concern in the top, the upper right hand corner of the graph. And so I guess put another way, these are communities that that we believe might see the biggest benefit to have a resilience hub project in their immediate vicinity. So outreach to those communities will be prioritized using those metrics and happen sooner, so we can make those communities available of this opportunity for feasibility studies to be provided at no cost, so that they can learn more about again, what resilience would look like at a critical facility in their community. And then I would, I'll jump to number 3 with another example, I guess, because, they haven't really been fully developed yet, but I would imagine a pathway in which the scoring rubric that will be used to review the applications for, for grant match funding, to also include resilience metric scores as, as one of the, several elements of consideration during that review. So hopefully that makes sense. I couldn't see it, but I think that there was maybe a comment in the chat. Is that right, Morgan?
You are so on top of things, Ryan. Maybe the RH should stand for Ryan Hart. I think that it might tap into some other SMEs, but the comment question rather was from Alessandra De La Torre, and it's another thought I had was how/if high-risk zones based on PAC's wildfire data is considered in these resilience scores. So I think that might loop back. So wondering if we should invite Kevin back to the stage for here for a second here. And he might have gone and grabbed some water. So actually, why don't we go ahead and finish out your section, Ryan, and then we'll circle back. Oh, sure. Spoke too soon. Kevin is now back with us and on camera.
Hey, yeah, thanks. And thanks for the question. So the high fire risk zones that we developed for our wildfire mitigation programs, they're not directly incorporated into the resilience analysis. We're primarily looking at from our utility-derived data, primarily at our customer data, and then also the outage data or the reliability data that we can apply to this, where we factor in things like susceptibility to specific hazards. It primarily comes from some of the data that's going into the various community resilience characteristics, so things like the evacuation or preparedness categories in particular.
Alessandra, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Mostly also curious if it's something that can be considered in the resilience score. just thinking about that susceptibility for folks in those communities, and just how much more vulnerable they could be if they're in a high risk zone. So that's kind of why I'm thinking like how we could add just even more nuance to those scores. But yeah, that answers my question to see what else, what other data and kind of metrics that are being used that have been named here.
Right.
Thanks, I appreciate that feedback. And it brings up a point too of potentially vulnerability, not just the wildfires, but other types of natural disasters, and where there might be data or maps available, how those could be incorporated. I'm thinking of things like the earthquake risk maps, for example, or like the tsunami zones and things like that. So something we can bring back to the team as we kind of continue to evolve the analysis here to see how we can start bringing those types of data into the analysis.
Thank you for the feedback. I want to, one, encourage this continued dialogue. So go ahead and continue dropping those questions in the chat. So for example, I do see your question, Nikita. I'm gonna go ahead and have Ryan conclude his portion, and then we're gonna circle back and have Lee Elder respond to your question around CBIs here after the CBRE portion concludes. But again, highly encouraged. This is why we are here today. We want to hear these questions and comments. So we will circle back to any items that are dropped in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. This is good stuff. All right, so I think we can move on to the next slide. And in the spirit of that intersectionality, and while it maybe could potentially go without saying, I also wanted to spotlight the CBRE RH pilot as a key vehicle. In fact, some folks were bringing it up a little bit earlier today that that we're going to be using to advance that CBI metric related to resiliency. So some people on the call might recall me speaking about the study that was developed by the Oregon Department of Energy in 2022 on small scale and renewable energy projects. In fact, some of you may have probably been on the team that developed that. So, but one key takeaway that that we found really quite important in that report was that local resilience is the the one unique potential benefit of projects of this type. So you see the RCBI on the top in green, and then a quote from that study down on the bottom. And this pilot has a focus on this specific subset of CBRE projects that actually would provide potentially that local resilience that CBREs in general have the potential to. So, as an example, I guess, a solar farm that's built to participate in community solar is a great CBRE, but it wouldn't necessarily provide that direct community resilience in the time of an outage event, for example, right? So the projects that are going to be associated with this pilot are going to be designed, to provide community resilience, for local emergency services and or the immediate community in the surrounding area. So so that's that's one way that we're able to really hone in on an opportunity for us to to make real impact here. So hopefully that rings true for all of you on the line. And then the last slide that I have is actually a reference to an input opportunity. I believe I saw a link just get dropped into the chat. There's a form that we have created to gather some feedback from any and all who are interested on the call or not. Because we're getting into the final stages of the development of a filing for the approval of this CBRE RH pilot. And so kind of specific to this, not necessarily, but in some ways specific to this this interim resilience CBI, we have a couple of targeted questions that we would really appreciate folks to kind of weigh in upon as we do our final considerations related to this pilot. And so I wanted to just to take a minute or two to kind of go over these things. I don't presume that anyone was able to actually look at the form that was emailed to them a couple of days ago. Although Morgan, I think you emailed me is that from someone in this meeting? Like, is someone getting a gold star today for like turning it in early? Or was that from a previous meeting? Was that from the CBIG?
We had an early submission, so
oh my gosh.
Somebody did some homework to come today. Not required,
extra credit.
but
okay.
Absolutely gold star.
Okay, so I wanted to run through these questions. It's actually expanded a little bit more in the forum, but just to make sure that everyone was kind of on the same page with what it is that we're hoping to hear from folks who are interested in, helping to shape this this pilot. So, this first, question, which I'm sure that you're more than capable of reading on your own, in other words, what we're hoping for is how we might or what we might track so that we could be gauging progress towards improving the resiliency of a community. And I think that Alessandra and Sylvia, you were both kind of scratching at this earlier in our conversation. So this will be, I don't know who it was that turned in that form, but this would be a big opportunity for us to kind of expand on some of the thoughts that are being shared. So I would say that while we kind of angled this towards feedback that's specific to the outreach that we're proposing to provide to specific communities. So it could be a metric could be something like the number of touches that we make as a utility to community members about the pilot offerings. But if you want to think about it more generally, like the broader advancement of resiliency, it could be something like like I think that maybe it was Sylvia you were saying, like the number of projects built, in the service area that we can track over time. So that number one might be very helpful. Number two, when it comes to, I don't know, to reaching out to actual facilities, are there recommendations about how to successfully do that? That these actual places. I mean, should we, get a list of fire stations and pick up the phone, or thinking about maybe starting with county representatives, or like focus efforts on leveraging nonprofits or community contacts that we have. I mean, we do have regional business managers that are embedded in all of our communities, but your expertise here and experience is something that we we really value too. So that's number two. Number three, we've heard feedback from stakeholders that incentive dollars, earlier in a project's construction or even the design would be, unsurprisingly helpful. But we've also heard the opposite, which is, surrounding concerns that providing incentives to projects that may not actually ever cross the finish line is it's not something that folks are comfortable with. And so the form actually has sort of an expansion on this two-part question about if and then potentially how much funding should or could be provided to projects that are kind of in the midst of their development. And then the fourth question is, it feels pretty straightforward, I guess, but we want to know if you feel as though incentive dollars should be spent only on like project related costs, or should project managers be able to use that funding at their discretion. So as I said or mentioned or hinted at, we're on this final the final lap with this pilot. I really would like to get it filed as soon as we possibly can. So I'm hoping that folks with thoughts could provide that input form back to us by the 30th. I think it's on the form. If you haven't looked at it already, there's a submit button at the bottom. So it makes it pretty simple for you, but you can also email it. I think that there's an email that that is listed there also. So anyway, I thank you in advance for that help, and I look forward to seeing you the next time with the report that we filed it, and it's approved and we're moving forward. So that's all I had, although I think there was another question there. So Morgan,
Yeah,
maybe you can help.
so gonna open it up for some discussion to Ryan before circling back to CBIs and resilience as a whole. But we do have a question for you, Ryan, from Alessandra. Does Pacific Power have grant funding amount per project or an estimate right now?
Well, I think we're still playing with the numbers a little bit, but what I can tell you is that it would be, because we're focusing primarily on the battery storage component of this larger project, that would be, the sizing of that system would be how we would prorate the funding. So it would be on, a per kilowatt amount of the size, the capacity of the battery. And so, a larger project with, or at least a larger battery in a project would likely be receiving more of an incentive, the financial award for participating with us, than something that was smaller. Hopefully that answers your question enough.
Seeing a thumbs up.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments for Ryan? Sylvia, welcome to the virtual stage.
Thank you. Ryan, do you have a sense for the pilot as a whole in terms of financial or money numbers yet? Of how much you might allocate and how much you're expecting to support? Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of a balance to some extent, because we want to make it meaningful enough for for participation in those various components, and really move folks along, give them what they need so that they can be successful. But at the same time, we don't want to make this so large in with funding, at least, that that we that we're taking money that otherwise might be better spent elsewhere, supporting projects or communities in other ways. And so I think that right now it's right around $3 million that we're proposing that we ask maybe a little bit more than that. I've been in conversation recently with actually a new leadership team that is now the project champions of this pilot, and and they're really excited and are giving me indications early, mind you, that that there might be an opportunity to to move faster and get bigger. Maybe not initially, but potentially over time, depending on how things start to feel after the first year or so, which was really positive feedback. So I feel like there are going to be a lot of eyes on this, and a lot of interest, of course, both internally and externally. So I'm very hopeful. I guess I'll end it there.
Thank you, Ryan. And then I have one more question. I've heard a lot of focus on critical facilities, which I usually tend to associate with like hospitals, fire stations, governmental facilities. And then I'm wondering if your definition might be more expansive to include the community accessible type of spaces, or if it isn't right now, if it could be. And I don't know what, if we may get any projects of that nature, getting to the stage where they can apply and take advantage of the match funding or the feasibility study. But that could be interesting, just because as I'm thinking, some of the facilities that we tend to think as critical facilities can sometimes not be accessible to everyone in the community, or, they provide an important role that I don't want to de-emphasize, but might be less, where people can gather and come and the disaster, unless you're like sick at the hospital, or, so yeah, that's where my mind went. It might be already covered in your definition of critical facility, and if not, I wonder if you'll be open to expanding, again, not knowing how much you'll get from that type of projects.
Yeah, that's a fabulous bit of feedback, Sylvia. Thank you. are, in the draft of the, the filing proposal, we have a definition that we really like that we've actually used before, and it came originally from a program in California. But the reason we like it is it's because it's quite expansive, and it's not just a fire station or, the police command center, but it includes, other, maybe non-traditional facilities that that communities in our service area would find critical, including a corner store in a very potentially rural area that people not only would need to leverage for food and water, but also information as as a kind of a gathering space. And so happy to send that over to you if you want to take a look at it, but it is quite broad. So a lot of folks will be able to play with us.
That's really cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. And yes, I will be curious. Just
Okay.
not like an expert in that, but I'll be curious to learn more and see what you're using. Thank you.
Sure.
Yep, and I'll add that there was some agreement from both Nikita and Alessandra on your comment, Sylvia. So thank you so much for providing that feedback. I think that's something that'll definitely be very helpful. And
Thank you,
Sylvia,
Sylvia.
thank you for providing your contact. We really appreciate that. I'll also note that Ryan has been emphatic about having as much input as possible and has done every effort to do so. So highly encourage sharing this form with anyone that might be interested. They do not have to be on this call today. And we're just really excited to see what comes back. Alessandra, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Talking about more input, some other thoughts that are coming up are I guess I have a question around like the same, thinking about like long-term things that Pacific Power could be investing in. I'm also thinking about some of the smaller components of resiliency and like preparedness for communities. Simple one could be like cell phone charging stations. For instance, like I live in Medford, Oregon. The hospital local to me, their emergency room doesn't have any charging stations, right? So if you go there and you don't have your phone charger, you might not be able to contact people, and people are there for sometimes 6 hours on end just in the waiting room, right? So those are, I know they're niche and they're really small, but those are also they're so impactful when there is emergencies, both on the day-to-day, but also when there's disasters in these places that people kind of convene in. So wondering, and also just like giving that input of how some of these projects could also then be maybe a little bit less of these big investments, but smaller, more I guess, attainable projects that Pacific Power could invest in, but that also help serve in these like CBI kind of goals and categories that y'all have.
Great question, Alessandra. I think that we might need to connect the right people in the room there to make sure that we really consider that, but we're definitely noting that feedback and totally agree that impacts can be measured in different ways, and really like the idea of having something that is both in times of those emergency events, but also in times of a daily emergency, right? Any other questions for Ryan here? Not seeing any, but again, that does not mean that if you think of some, that you cannot communicate them via chat or raise your hand. I do want to go ahead and circle back to some questions earlier that were dropped in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Kevin and Lee back to the stage. Nikita went ahead and dropped a question around the development of the other CBIs. And that she understands they're being discussed with the CBIHE, but would love to know the next steps and how far along they are in being developed and what they'll be used to assess.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Nikita, for the question. Lee here again. So let's see. Since we filed the CEP in May of 23, we've added 2 additional CBIs. Both of them are related to energy efficiency programs. So, you know, we heard feedback that made us realize that we needed to incorporate some CBIs around energy efficiency. And so we've incorporated those. That was incorporated back in October. More recently, we've been involved with conversations with our tribal advisory group. We wanted to have focused conversations with tribal representatives to talk about challenges in their communities. And more recently, I mean, in the last, golly, I want to say last month and a half. So very recently, we've been having conversations with our tribal advisory group to talk through, you know, issues in their communities, to see what sort of relationships we have currently with the CBIs that are developed. And if, you know, they don't exist, we are taking that feedback and are going to assess whether or not we need to incorporate updated CBIs to address the challenges that we're hearing from our tribal advisory group. So, I mean, that's kind of in flight at the moment, sort of stuff. But we're working right now, mostly that's where the CBI development is currently. And then I guess we're always in CBI development phase, to be honest. You know, these meetings we have right now, you know, anything we hear around metrics, you know, the feedback we've had so far today has been just excellent. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at with CBI development land right now.
Thank you for that context, Lee. I think it's very helpful to kind of have that wider view of overall progress and status. So really appreciate the question, Nikita, and really appreciate the response, Lee.
Yep. I don't know, before we leave, Nikita, does that answer your question, or do you have anything following up on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions on CBI's resilience or the CBRE pilot program? Before we move to public comment, would love to hear. Not seeing any, but if I spoke too soon, great news. The next slide is public comment. So I would love to open up the floor to just hear anything, any thoughts, comments that you'd like to share with PacifiCorp and get some responses to. Not seeing anything, but right as I was about to say, I notoriously say that right as a hand goes up. So Sylvia.
I'm always really good to waiting for the last minute. Sorry about that. I have a process question about how does the company sees this space interacting with this IRP forum. I remember there was a question when I had just finally been able to join, so I don't know if I got the whole question, but there's a question about House Bill 2021. targets and how they were being incorporated. And I think it was during Ryan's presentation, but again, I just caught the end of it. And so that just led me to wonder how are you seeing this space informing all of that work? Like, are there decisions that are going to be brought here and also considered the feedback that you get here and incorporated into the IRP-CEP development space? Or how do you all see the interaction between the different forums?
That is a great question. I think that I'll start with a broad answer of, on the back end, I know that there's a lot of work to really streamline and provide information in a cast a wide net, basically, right? And so there's a lot of work on the back end to really make sure that we are bringing the information to a bunch of different spaces. I don't think Randy Baker is on the line anymore. I think he had to drop for another meeting, but happy to circle up with him specifically and get more context and color on how he envisions that in the IRP space specifically, outside of maybe the broader regulation or advisory group type engagements. I think that, as you all know, some of these real technical concepts, it's a balance of really bringing them to these different spaces and in a really productive and effective way. But Lee, I think I saw you come off mute. Did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to how the relationship between, the IRP and with CBIs, briefly. There are, we have two CBIs that are specifically related to, have a relationship with IRP. Environmental, which is related to, emissions, that's one of the items related to, IRP development. You can look at emissions that are coming from IRP portfolios, and that's a metric that we're tracking in our CBI space. And then what is the other one? The other one is related to energy not served. That's another metric that that's relevant in this context because it's a resiliency item that we're tracking. When you look at portfolios that come out of the IRP, you can look at energy not served and see how one is more reliable than the other. So those are the two, some connective tissue there between CBIs and the IRP. And, I'm sure Randy has been asked this question in other forums, and he's just not available at the moment. But those are the two that come to mind when you ask that question, Sylvia, for me.
Thank you, Leah. I appreciate it. And I look forward to continue to having the conversation as we, I work on, future CPs and continue implementation of the past CP. Thank you.
Any other public comment prior to closing, going to next steps and closing out the meeting? Not seeing any, so why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide tag. So just quickly wanted to make sure everyone was apprised of future engagements so that they're able to plan accordingly and fully engage on the topics of interest for the respective individuals in the room. We will be having a second, there needs to be a correction on that. It will be the second for this year, but that will be in September. We don't have an official date quite yet, but we are working to get that nailed down and then sent out as soon as possible. We understand that in order for you all to participate effectively, we need to communicate as soon as possible. And we really strive to make continual progress in that effort. Hence us getting these slides out a little bit earlier and hopefully with some time to review. But we continue to improve upon our process and are excited for your continued participation in this venue. Other engagement spaces for Oregon include the tribal nations, as well as the Community Benefits and Impact Advisory Group, with those dates and meeting information there on the slide. And again, these are all available online. So would love to see you in those spaces should you find that interesting. But with that, it closes our Friday morning off, and want to thank you for your participation and wish you all a very happy weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.